Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. As you all can see, I have with me Brigadier Rahul Bhonsle, who's a retired veteran from the Indian Army and the director of the Security Risks Asia. Sir, thank you so much for joining me today to discuss the ongoing crisis with regard Ukraine, Russia, and the United States, along with NATO, and the potential impact of that crisis on India.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aadi, for having me. Thank you.
Pleasure's mine, sir. So a lot many would not, really understand that the Ukraine is far away country. It's a matter between Russia and the United States. How does India come into the picture in the entire paradigm? Why don't you just give us an introduction as to how does India feature into this entire conflict which is taking place?
Yes, I think there's a very important question. As you very correctly said, now not many people are appreciating that the situation in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia, US, etc. If the situation deteriorates further, India will be one of the first countries to be impacted, not so much from the point of view of the conflict factor, but definitely from the point of view of our strategic partnership which we are having with a number of countries in this region. Now, as all of us know, India and Russia are the longest strategic partners, extending back to the Soviet Union in the 1970s. Today, we have got a very strong military, defense, nuclear, space, energy. You talk any field, we've got a very strong partnership with Russia. On the other hand, with the United States, in the last 2 decades, we have developed a very strong relations in multiple spheres, including defense, economic and trade relations. So that's a very important relationship for us. Now you go on to the European Union per se, or the Europe per se. In Europe, you have got the European Union is one of our largest trading partners. You have countries like France, Germany, who are again very close partners to us in various fields, including economy and defense. UK is another important country in that. Ukraine is also a very important partner for India, and we have got a very strong relationship with Ukraine as well. It may be surprising for some, given the fact that Ukraine and Russia are constantly in conflict, but still we have maintained a balance in our relationship, and to that extent, any sort of a disruption in Ukraine itself makes challenges for us. So when you see the entire paradigm, a large number of our strategic partners are involved in this conflict. I have not mentioned many other European countries, for example, Poland, again a very important partner. We have now the East European or the Central European countries, again very important, and their relationship with Russia vis-a-vis NATO is going to impact with us in a very big way. Now, so far, post the World War II and post the Cold War, we have had a very balanced activities which have been going on, but in the last decade or so, this has deteriorated slightly, starting with the conflict in Georgia, Crimea, and now in Ukraine. So India's efforts have always been to act in a balanced manner so that the strategic partnership which we have with the countries in the region, with the countries in conflict, that continues to be maintained in a way that is beneficial for all our relationship in multiple spheres. So from the immediate perspective, this is not something which is going to hit us as something happening on our borders, but definitely in a very short, medium, and even long-term perspective, any conflict in the European scenario, particularly between Ukraine and Russia, which involves India's other strategic partners like the United States, UK, Germany, France, and other EU countries, is going to have a very major impact on our strategic relationship, and that's what we have to look at.
So before we get into the entire conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which is, I think it's been discussed quite a bit in the open media as well, I'd like to ask you one simple question. A lot of the time, the Western media or the contemporary media, if I may put it that way, treats Russia like the enemy. I am no friend of the Russians or the Americans, but I'd like to understand one simple thing. A lot of people go back to the Crimea, the crisis during the annexation of Crimea, and talk about Russian aggression. There is also another perspective that you and I were discussing some time back, as in, the need for Russia to do what it did at that time. May I request you to kind of, take us through what that need was and why does, the West not able to understand what the Russians are wanting to do?
Yes, you see, they have very correctly highlighted that there is a difference in perception. Now, what happened is, post the Cold War and the rejuvenation of Russia, there has been an understanding with the EU as well as NATO that the Russian sphere of influence, which extends between Russia on going on to Europe, which includes a number of countries in the Central and the Eastern European belt, such as Ukraine, for example, Georgia. All these, the expansion of NATO as well as expansion of the democracy experiment towards these countries will not impact the security or create insecurity for Russia. And that was a pact which has been made between the European Union and Russia as well as NATO and Russia. And this was an understanding which held up for a long time. At the same time, you find that Russia has also been following certain aggressive policies, expanding its influence, political, diplomatic, and economic influence in these areas which we just talked about, including in Ukraine. So, by the time about 2010-11, when the Georgian operations took place, and thereafter, there has been a huge divide between the two sides, where the Russian position on the expansion of European Union and democracy experiment and NATO towards their western frontiers, and the Russian expansion towards Europe in the political and diplomatic domain, particularly in the information domain as well. There has been a clash in that perception, and this clash has had a number of flashpoints. One is, of course, Georgia, which was, of course, Russia's intervention there that did not as much invoke the type of reactions it should have. But had the Georgian conflict been resolved in a manner which was satisfactory to both sides, EU, NATO, and Russia, when I say EU and NATO, it also, of course, includes the United States, then possibly we will not be having the further flashpoints. Crimea is another place where 2013, again, that conflict or the perceptions are still brewing, and now we have Ukraine. So this difference of perceptions, and that is where also possibly the resolution lies as far as the present crisis is concerned, that each to ingress into each other's area of influence is something which is not acceptable to both sides, whether it is United States, EU, and NATO, or to Russia. Where to draw the line, and that has been the challenge, and this is how the situation has been progressing. Now, as far as India is concerned, India, as I said, has always had a balanced relationship with all partners, but India has always not like to have any situation changed by use of force or the coercive methods. And that's where I think the Indian position lies, that is a principled position of India. And India has also has to take into consideration the position of partners. So that's the way I think the overall geopolitical situation, European situation, and the Indian situation is. One important factor which you have to also highlight is that Europe is going back to the legacy conflicts of the 20th century, not as much the legacy, but between. The 20th century, of course, was a very fractious century for Europe, a very violent century. Europe has moved beyond that, but now the conflict is occurring between the Western Europe and Russia, and the Western Bloc and Russia. And this is a new dimension which is emerging. So how the Europeans and the Russians and the United States are able to resolve this is something which we'll have to wait and see.
Interesting. So you mentioned India as well, and I'd like to kind of bring about a piece of news that came out a couple of days ago when both the foreign ministers, Sergei Lavrov and Antony Blinken of Russia and United States, respectively, were meeting in Geneva. The news talked about both of them having briefed the Indian foreign minister, Jai Shankar, on the developing situation. Now, that's something which was a bit unique. We are basically being connected by both the parties and informed, and not because of anything else, but one kind of wants to understand why India was brought into the picture in the entire game here.
Quite true. You see, as I said earlier, right in the beginning, for India is a question of partners, and all the partners are very dear to us. I mean, we cannot afford to sort of, have any misunderstanding or any misconception being developed by any of the partners. At the same time, there are certain principles here in place. So India is in this apparent balance between the partners. India is trying to understand what exactly is the perception of both sides, and the United States and Russia being the principal actors. I think it is very important for us to keep in constant touch with whatever the developments are happening, and through the foreign ministers, I think it has been a very good development. I think last week, I think the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State of the United States, she spoke to our Foreign Secretary, Mr. Singla, and they had exchanged notes, and I'm sure this would have included the situation in Ukraine and understanding of that, apart from various other factors. So I think keeping close touch with India is very important for both sides, Russia as well as the US and the US.
So the West's predominant fear of Russia is something that I'd like to take up with you next. Is one of the things that we notice is the Russians today aren't as aggressive as the erstwhile USSR was, but the lens that the West judges Russia is pretty much the same. They may have their issues in terms of their style of leadership and this and that, but having said that, from what I read, the Russian outlook towards the world is very different today, and they don't have the kind of power that they used to yield when they were the former Soviet Union. Why is it that the West predominantly focuses towards Russia as a threat rather than the emerging threat of China, which is actually damaging them more today?
Quite true. You see, the point is that this is a legacy. Now, if you have had contestations with a country for many, many years, and mind you, interestingly, in the 20th century, the West and Russia joined together for both during the First as well as the Second World War. So there is a mixed legacy of sorts between between the two sides. But the most central piece to this Russian expansion is the insecurities which are felt in the Central European countries, the Visegrad countries, as they call, the insecurities that are being felt there. And that is where I think the contestation lies. Because in Central Europe has had borne the mark of Russian influence for many, many decades post the Second World War, after during the period of the Soviet Union. So those scars are still there, and they are not not going to go away very easily. As we know, when the two countries, they take offensive postures over a period of time. Every time the postures, the opposition starts getting hardening. When this hardening of position finally comes on to the boiling point, and that boiling point may erupt at one point of time. And that is, I think, the legacy, I think, is very, very strong. Plus, you see, the United States fears that the Russia, though it's Russia which is not economically strong, Russia which is not, even I would say politically that strong, but Russia has got immense diplomatic and military power, and Russia is willing to excise that. The willingness of Russia to excise its political and diplomatic as well as military influence is evident, whether it is in the Middle East, whether it is in countries like Syria. So that willingness of Russia to sort of intervene by using its political, diplomatic, military tools is something the United States and the European Union countries, particularly the Central European Visegrad countries, are very much concerned. And the dimension of the political power is, as you know, there have been various reports, allegations that Russia is intervening in the political systems of the country, and particularly during the elections. Now, this is another dimension which the Russian challenge is being sort of faced or concerned, which concerns the West. So I think there are multiple factors which are involved in the entire dynamics. But all said and done, despite the weak economic position of Russia, I think it still carries considerable political, diplomatic, and military clout. So it will have to form a part of any geopolitical sort of a decision making.
Interestingly, sir, one of the things that India and the analysts in India write about is the more the tensions that grow between the United States and the Russians, the more issues that there would be for the Indian defense procurements, for that matter, or planned procurements in the future from the Russians. There are rumors about the S-500. The S-400 is still not fully delivered. Do you think this conflict would have any impact on the Indian procurement of weapons and arms from Russia?
You see, India's position has been very clear. The sanctions which are unilateral in nature are not acceptable to India. So the United States, Europe, or whatever sanctions they put on Russia, for example, in the Ukraine situation deteriorates, definitely that will create some hurdles for our military and defense engagement with Russia. But I think we should be able to tide over it, because all our present agreements are virtually concluded, watertight agreements, and they are under delivery. And we should be able to stave off any challenge which comes. So, for example, there is all talk of CAATSA imposition, etc., etc. But then the pressure will go on the United States internally if the Ukraine conflict boils over and there is lethal violence takes place. Then the pressure on United States internally is going to grow, and then these sanctions, CAATSA, etc., they start biting. So it will impose hurdles. It will impose immense hurdles on us. It may not really lead us to sort of blocking the, getting more equipment from Russia, but it will definitely impose some hurdles, and I think we should be able to get over it.
India will have to play a lot of diplomacy, and the game, if I may say, has to begin pretty much, for India's purpose. So one thing that we see is that the Chinese being very quiet about this entire thing, apart from one odd statement that came out, which was pretty much a regular, diplomatic statement. We hope that these things can be resolved in peace and quiet and this and that. Beyond that, the Chinese have actually kept quiet, and that's unlike China not to comment on something where the West or the United States, for that matter, is involved in a sort of a brawl, if I may use that word. Why do you think so, sir?
You see, the Chinese have also got very strong partnership in this region. Russia-China partnership, as we know, is very deep, and politically as well as diplomatically is quite very, very strong. Maybe as much or even stronger than India and Russia. But then Chinese interests in these countries, which are likely to go into conflict or likely to go into a sort of under the sanctions mode, etc., etc. I think Chinese economic interest, Chinese trade interest, Chinese so-called Belt and Road Initiative, where it has gone, the Silk Road economic belt passes all over the European continent and going into, right up to Amsterdam. And so they have got very huge interest. Now, they would not like to sort of intervene in that. Secondly, Chinese position has always been that they do not openly intervene in such conflicts. Yes, last time they did make some favorable comments in favor of Russia as far as Crimea is concerned. And they did, of course, supported Russia in some ways, much more than possibly India did openly. But on the whole, they always remain neutral in such issues and try the situation to develop. Because China is also now becoming, having global interests, having interests, economic, trade, diplomacy, and political, multiple interests across this belt. So if they try to intervene or try to sort of intervene or interject in favor of Russia, we are quite sure that things can go really, really bad. And as we saw recently, there were some statements made from the German naval chief, and this was taken very, very adversely in Ukraine. And so the sensitivity of the issue, I think Chinese do realize. So they are not likely to take a very strong position either way.
As a matter of fact, if I'm corrected and updated, he's been asked to step down. So that's a very, very strong reaction to what has happened in terms of just a dialogue or just a statement that was made. So coming towards the end, the European Union also finds itself in a sticky sort of a position, especially Germany, as you mentioned. German gas imports and European gas imports predominantly come from Russia, and becomes a sort of a sticky wicket for them to kind of come along and play on the front foot against Russia. There has been deliberations up and down. The Eastern European countries are going against China, so that China-Russia bloc kind of gets affected there. How do you think the European Union is going to kind of react to this entire situation? And this on the basis of that very loose statement made by President Biden from the States about the level of activity done by Russia against Ukraine. So that brings in a little bit of an ambiguity of the reaction one would expect coming out of Ukraine in case the balloon does go up. How do you see this entire thing, sir?
Yeah, you see, the European Union, as I see today, is divided. There are countries, and in this division, one can see that there is a those countries who are pro-US, very closely allied with the United States, such as UK, Poland, the Baltic countries. They are making very stronger statements than possibly countries like Germany. And I believe now the UK and the Baltic countries are even sending the US lethal weapons and equipment to Ukraine. They are transferring that. Whereas Germany has taken a very strong stand. They said, no, no lethal equipment will be transferred, weapons and equipment will be transferred to Ukraine. Yes, if you want some medical assistance, field ambulances and all that, we are willing to provide you, but not from the lethal point of view, we will not. So I think this division is what possibly people say that Russia may be benefiting from this division, etc., etc. But this is something which the United States and the European Union have to sort out and get together. And I think because the advantage of this division also will definitely go towards Russia in the present crisis. Whether the Russians will, the oil and gas, etc., supplies to Europe will be impacted by this whole situation, we'll have to wait and see. Because Russia is also going through a very economic challenge per se. And the challenge is going to grow if the sort of gas pipelines and etc., their income is going to, sort of cut off or go slow. So I think this is going to be a challenge for both sides. The point is that the mood in the European Union, as far as the big players are concerned, France, Germany is for reconciliation, but the mood in some other countries, which are generally very closely aligned to the United States, is to prevent Russia from expanding its influence in Ukraine, because they're worried that what Russia wants first is a pro-Russia government in Ukraine. So they already got the network there. Secondly, they want a commitment from NATO that we will not expand towards the Russia's western frontiers and the states in that. So these two are the Russian bottom line, and so European Union has to seriously consider these bottom lines which Russia is accepting, whether they are willing to accept this or not, or in what form they want to accept. I think it's good that this is resolved diplomatically, because as I said earlier, any lethal or any violent conflict in this zone is not going to be beneficial for any other country, including India.
Absolutely, sir. So as a part of the closing comments, sir, how would you like to see India playing its cards, although a very delicate situation, but what steps would you like to see India taking in the coming future?
Yes, you see, I think on one hand, I think India, I'm sure, would be looking at trying to sort of calm down the situation with its major strategic partners in their interaction. Whether somebody listens to India or not, it doesn't matter. But the point is, we have to put in our word. Secondly, India has also to prepare itself, and that if push comes to shove and there is a conflict, and what will be the impact on our, firstly, diplomatic relations with these countries, what will be the political impact, and what will be the impact on our economy, trade, as well as the defense. So that part is, I think, something which a lot of homework we'll have to continue, and hope that this does not have to be used in an actual situation, but still scenarios build up. We have to prepare for that and try to sort of see how best we can influence in calming down the situation there.
Absolutely, yes. It's always an interesting game of events, if I may place it like that, for India to be on both the sides of the battlefield. And we saw this happening with the Iranian crisis as well, and we've seen this happening multiple times with India because of our multilateral approach to relations with different countries around the world. Sir, thank you so much for throwing some light on the difficult situation that India finds itself in, apart from just the factor that both the sides are friends and both the sides, India has its own kind of requirements from both the sides for its own growth and development and security. So it becomes a very delicate sort of a game to play. I hope the government is thinking in the right direction and the diplomats are doing what they're supposed to do in a cohesive action plan to counter and to suppress this entire threat coming out of that region. Sir, thank you so much for joining me and taking us through this Ukrainian crisis and its impact on India. Till next time,
Thank you
sir.
very much.
Jai Hind.
Bye. Take care.